The Wyoming frontier stretched wide and merciless beneath a sky the color of pale steel. Wind tugged at the tall grasses, bending them in long, sighing waves that whispered of loneliness. Dust swirled where no wagon had passed in weeks, and the distant ridges burned gold beneath the sinking sun. It was a country that had no mercy for the unprepared, and Lizzy McNeel was already at its breaking edge. Her bare feet dragged across the dirt, blistered and bleeding, each step leaving faint smears of red in the dust. She had once been a farmer's daughter, used to fields and chores, her days framed by the laughter of siblings and the steady hum of her mother's voice. But that was before smallpox came, swift and cruel, sweeping through her home like a fire that consumed without flame. Within 1 week, her family was gone, her father, her mother, her 2 younger brothers. She had buried what she could with trembling hands, then left the farm behind because silence was worse than starvation. Now she wandered, days blurring together, her dress ragged, her body weakened from hunger. The land gave her nothing, no creek with fresh water, no berry bush, no kind traveler. The world had become only dust, sky, and her own shallow breathing. Somewhere to the west, she had heard whispers of ranches, of settlements where a girl might find work or even shelter, but the miles stretched endlessly, and she no longer trusted her own strength. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't had clean water in longer. The edges of her vision quivered black. On the horizon, she saw a figure on horseback. At first, she thought it a mirage trick of heat and light. The rider sat tall on a chestnut mare, moving with a steady rhythm that carried the calm certainty of one who belonged to this country. Dust trailed behind the hooves, rising in golden clouds that caught the light. Lizzy wanted to call out, but her throat scraped raw, no voice left. She raised a trembling hand instead. For a moment, the world tilted. Her knees gave, the hard earth rushing up to meet her. She collapsed with a soundless gasp. The rider slowed, pulling the reins until the mare halted. Silence stretched, broken only by the creak of leather and the distant cry of a hawk. Then boots touched the ground. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat brim casting a shadow over his face. His movements were deliberate, calm, like the prairie itself. He crouched beside her without a word, his eyes steady as they studied the faint rise and fall of her chest. Lizzy felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, yet through the haze she registered something strange. He did not speak. Not a greeting, not a question, not even her name, only silence. Strong arms lifted her, carrying her as though she weighed no more than a child. The smell of leather and horse filled her nose, and for the first time in days she let herself rest. Darkness took her. When she awoke again, she was beneath a wooden roof. A fire crackled nearby, the glow painting the log walls with warmth. She lay on a rough-hewn bed draped with a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. A basin of water sat beside her, and a tin plate with bread and beans rested on a table. Her stomach twisted painfully with hunger, but when she tried to sit up, dizziness forced her back down. She turned her head instead and saw him, the man from the plains. He sat in a chair near the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, practiced strokes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his jaw lined with dark stubble. A scar ran across the edge of his throat, pale against his tanned skin. His eyes gray as a winter sky lifted to hers. Still, he said nothing. Lizzy's lips parted, her voice hoarse. "Where am I?" No answer came. He set the knife aside, rose, and crossed the room. With quiet efficiency, he placed a plate of food in her hands. His touch was gentle but firm, steadying the tremor in her fingers. "Why don't you speak?" she whispered. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, unreadable, then turned away. He moved back to the fire, his silence louder than words. Exhaustion weighed on her again, but warmth filled her chest where cold had reigned for days. Whoever he was, this silent rancher had saved her. And though she did not yet know his name, she felt the first fragile stirrings of hope since the sickness had taken everything. The wind outside sighed against the cabin walls. Inside, Lizzy closed her eyes, bread clutched in her hand, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself believe she might live to see another dawn. Morning broke silver, light filtering through the cabin's chinks. Lizzy woke to coffee and wood smoke, to a hoarse snickering and the creak of a windlass. Her body felt leaden but steadier than the night before. The silent rancher was already moving, motions done with a precision like prayer. He slid a tin mug toward her and gestured, "Drink." She sat up and took the cup in both hands. The coffee was rough, but it clawed sleep from her bones. He handed her a clean cloth and pointed to the basin. She washed, marveling at cool water on warm skin. Through the open door she glimpsed prairie, low ridges, a stand of cottonwoods along a draw. A palomino gelding flicked his ears in the corral. The chestnut his mare shook her mane, tack chimed. In the near distance, a pale sandstone boulder rose from the grass, a streak of iron oxide cutting its face like a brushstroke of blood. Painted rock. He touched the brim of his hat and motioned, "Come." Pain prickled her heels. Memory answered with thorns and stones. He noticed. He knelt, opened a cedar chest, lifted a roll of linen, and wrapped her feet with patient care. He looked up as if asking permission to help her stand. She nodded. He steadied her. They stepped into the light. Wind carried the clean smell of sage. Bluebirds flitted along the rail. The cabin stood at the edge of a yard swept bare of grass, bordered by a wagon wheel set upright for a gate. Beyond, a haystack leaned under a tarp. Fenced pastures rolled. Away, cattle like punctuation. He led her to the boulder. Beneath the rust-red streak, shallow letters had been chiseled. Painted Rock Ranch John Steedman. She traced the name with a bandaged finger. "John," she said, and looked back to him. He nodded, tapped his throat, and shook his head. The scar at his neck shone pale. "I'm Lizzy," she whispered. "Lizzy McNeel." He weighed the name, then gestured toward the barn. Inside, tools were arranged by long habit. Harness hung clean and mended. A currycomb, worn smooth, lay beside a folded wool blanket. A carpenter's bench held pegs fitted so exactly into their holes she knew he measured twice and cut once. John lifted a slate from a shelf and pressed it into her hands with a chalk stub. He pointed to himself, then to the slate. She wrote, "Thank you." He read it and gave the smallest smile. In a neat hand he wrote, "You are safe." Her throat tightened. She underlined the words and nodded. Before they left the yard, he pointed to the water barrel, the woodpile, snares near the draw, laying out the laws with gestures. Water first, fire next, animals last, then rest. She nodded, grateful for rules she could hold and belong again. Work. began like summer rain, soft, then steady. He showed her how he fed the stock, how he checked the south fence, how to prime the pump when leather dried. She moved slowly, conserving strength, but the rhythm of tasks gave her shape. When she stumbled, he was there. When she managed alone, he led her. Midday brought stew tasting of beef, thyme, and long simmering. Lizzy ate until her hands trembled. Color returned to her face. A nap followed without shame. When she woke, the light had turned honey, and John was mending a bridle. He glanced up, made a circle with thumb and forefinger. Good? She nodded, almost smiled. "Why did you help me?" she asked at last. He held her gaze, then wrote 4 words. "Because I saw you." Her eyes burned. Below his collar she saw the jagged seam that had stolen his voice. She would learn the story in time. For now, it was enough that he had opened his door. Evening gathered, the sky banded in lavender and rose. Coyotes called from the far ridge. John set a lantern on a peg by the door and touched the brim of his. Had again a quiet habit. Then he wrote one last line and set the slate on the table. "Rest. Tomorrow we mend what's broken." The following days blurred into a rhythm Lizzy had almost forgotten, a rhythm of chores, firewood, and the honest ache of tired muscles instead of starvation. Each dawn, light slipped through the cabin's cracks, and John would already be awake, moving with deliberate purpose. He spoke in silence, but she began to understand his language, the way his hand brushed the brim of his hat to mean good morning, the firm nod toward the pasture that meant follow me, the tilt of his chin that warned her of danger in loose boards or wary cattle. For Lizzy, life took shape again, each day carved from the ruined smallpox had left behind. She learned how to carry water without spilling, how to tie fence wire tight with pliers that bit her palms raw, how to walk barefoot across grass without flinching at every pebble. The pain of her blistered feet faded beneath the bandages. John, refreshed each night, his touch steady and respectful. Yet at night, when shadows stretched long across the ranch yard, Lizzy lay awake and thought of the silence. Silence in her childhood home after smallpox, silence now in the presence of a Vela, man who could not speak. She wondered what tragedy had carved that scar across his throat, what words had been trapped forever in his chest. One evening, as wind whispered through the cottonwoods, she found courage to ask. They sat by the fire, stew warming between them. John sharpened his knife with long, even strokes, steel ringing faintly. Lizzy watched the blade catch firelight and swallowed. "Your voice," she said softly. "What happened?" His hand stilled. For a moment, she feared she had pried too far. Then, slowly, he set the knife aside and reached for the slate. His handwriting was clean, measured. Wife, child, fire. Her. Breath caught. 3 words, heavy as stones. He paused, then wrote again. Save them. Lost voice. Lizzy looked at him, eyes wide. His gaze met hers gray, steady, unflinching. She saw it then, the grief carried like a brand beneath his silence. A life torn open by tragedy, stitched closed by resilience. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt pale beside the weight of his truth. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." John gave a single nod, not dismissing her sorrow, but accepting it. Then he pushed the slate toward her with a gentleness that said, "Enough for tonight." In the days that followed, Lizzy carried his story in her heart. She thought of her own loss, her family gone in a week, and how grief had hollowed her until nothing was left but wandering feet and an empty stomach. Perhaps that was why she had stumbled into his life at Painted Rock. Two broken souls, drawn together by emptiness, finding in each other a reflection of survival. But the world beyond the ranch had no mercy for broken souls. It was late one afternoon when the first shadow fell across Painted Rock. Lizzy was tending the small garden near the cabin, pulling weeds with dirt-stained fingers when she heard the crunch of hooves. A horse approached, not John's chestnut or palomino. She stood, shielding her eyes against the sun. A rider loomed Randall Avery. He was a man whose grin never reached his eyes, his coat too fine for an honest rancher, his boots polished, though the land around him was dust. He tipped his hat lazily as his horse pawed at the ground. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like John's taken in a stray." Lizzy's stomach tightened. John stepped out from the barn then, wiping his hands on a rag, shoulders squared. He stopped between her and Avery, silent as stone. Avery smirked. "You know the debt's due, Steedman. Painted Rock ain't yours much longer. Papers say it belongs to me." John's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply stood, steady as a wall. Lizzy's heart pounded. She knew little of debts or land claims, but she saw the malice in Avery's eyes, the kind of malice that didn't stop at words. Avery leaned closer in his saddle. "I'll be back. And when I come, you'd best be gone, both of you." He wheeled his horse, dust rising in angry spirals, and rode off toward the horizon. The echo of hooves lingered long after he vanished. John's hands clenched at his sides. His silence had never seemed heavier. Lizzy looked at him, fear curling in her gut. What did he mean? She whispered. John didn't answer. He walked inside, fetched the slate, and wrote one word: fraud. He underlined it, chalk biting hard, then another: trouble. The sky had already darkened with storm clouds gathering over the ridges. Lizzy shivered, though the wind was warm. Painted Rock was no longer just a place of safety. It was a target. The storm broke that night. Lightning split the horizon, jagged white teeth tearing the sky. Rain hammered the cabin roof, the thunder rolling like cannon fire across the plains. Lizzy lay awake, listening to the fury outside and the steady movements of John nearby as he checked the shutters, banked the fire, and kept the place tight against the storm. But no storm outside could match the one that brewed within her. Avery's words replayed in her mind, that smirk, that certainty. A man like him did not come alone. She had heard rumors on the trail whispers of gangs that preyed on ranchers, men and women alike, squeezing them with false debts, forged documents, and the threat of the gun. When dawn came, washed clean by rain, John saddled his chestnut. Lizzy, still weary, watched him strap his rifle into its boot. He did not need the slate to tell her what he planned. He would ride out, gather word, see if Avery's threat had weight. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. He shook his head, pointed at the cabin, then at her, then back at the land. "Stay." "No," her jaw set. "I won't hide." For a long moment, his eyes searched hers. Then he handed her the slate. She wrote quickly, "I've survived worse." He read it, lips pressing into a thin line, and finally relented. Together, They rode out into a land still steaming from last night's rain. The trail led east toward a trading post where news traveled faster than the telegraph. Along the way, Lizzy saw the true shape of Painted Rock country. Deep draws cut by flash floods, cottonwoods clinging stubbornly to the banks, cattle scattered across endless grass. It was beautiful, and it was fragile. A man like Avery could break it with a single piece of paper. At the post, they tethered the horses and stepped inside. The room smelled of tobacco, coffee grounds, and sweat. A half-dozen men lingered near the counter, their voices low. But when John entered, silence fell. A heavy-set man spat into a tin, heard Avery's macking his play. Saying the ranch is his by right, another snorted. By fraud's more like it. But he's got papers, signed and sealed. Lizzy frowned. Papers can be forged. Not when they're backed by Margaret Dylan, the man muttered. The name cut through the air like a blade. Even Lizzy, newcomer to these parts, had heard. It whispered. Margaret Dylan, leader of the Copper Blood Gang. Ruthless, cunning, and twice as feared as any man who rode with her. She was said to be as sharp with a rifle as she was with a ledger, a woman who built her empire on both fear and falsehoods. The heavy-set man lowered his voice. Avery's just her front. She sends him in, polite enough, papers in hand. Folks that don't yield. Well, the Copperblood finish what he starts. Lizzy glanced at John. His jaw was set like stone, his gray eyes unreadable. He wrote on the slate, "We need proof." Proof? The man scoffed. You'll need Wyatt Earp himself to knock holes in Margaret's papers. Lizzy felt her stomach tighten. Earp, Dodge City. Lawman who carried reputation enough to face down gangs like Copper Blood. She turned to John. Then that's where we go. John's silence was answer enough. His hand brushed the brim of his hat, a signal of agreement. But before they left, trouble found them. The door slammed open. A pair of riders entered, water still dripping from their slickers. Red scarves tied at their throats marked them as Dylan's. Their eyes swept the room, then landed on John and Lizzy. Well, if it ain't the mute rancher, one sneered. And the girl he picked up off the prairie. Avery said we might find you here. Lizzy stiffened. John stood tall, hand drifting toward the rifle slung across his back. The outlaw noticed, grinned, and tapped the butt of his own pistol. Easy there. We ain't come to fight. Just a friendly message from Margaret Dylan. Surrender Painted Rock, and she might let you keep your skin. The trading post had gone still, the air tight as a drawn bowstring. Lizzy's voice cut the silence. Tell Margaret we don't bow to thieves. The outlaw's grin widened. Brave words from a stray. Let's hope you live long enough to regret, em. They left, spurs jangling, laughter trailing behind. Lizzy's heart thundered in her chest, but when she turned to John, she found calm in his gaze. He reached for the slate and wrote 2 words, Dodge City. The path was clear. If Painted Rock was to survive, they would need allies strong enough to face the Copper Blood Gang and lawmen fierce enough to tear Avery's fraud to pieces. The road to Dodge City was long, and it carried the weight of both hope and danger. John and Lizzy rode at dawn, the prairie glowing gold beneath the sun. Painted Rock shrank behind them until it was just a shadow on the horizon. Every mile farther made Lizzy's heart twist. She had only just begun to feel it as home. Yet now they rode away, chased by the threat of Margaret Dylan's gang. The trail east was busy with wagon trains and drifters, cattle herds bound north on the trail. Lizzy studied each face they passed, searching for signs of trouble, but it was John's steady presence beside her that kept fear at bay. His silence was no longer empty to her. It was strength. When she faltered, when memories of Avery's smirk crept into her thoughts, John's calm gray eyes anchored her. At night they camped under stars so bright they seemed alive. Lizzy lay awake listening to the coyotes' chorus and the snap of firewood. John kept watch without complaint, his rifle across his knees. More than once she caught him looking toward the west, toward Painted Rock, as though he feared it would vanish if he didn't hold it in his gaze. On the third night, they crossed paths with a wagon limping along the trail. A wheel had broken. Its axle split. A family of 4 struggled in the dusk. Lizzy and John dismounted. Together they heaved, patched, and bound the wood until the wagon could roll again. The father pressed a hand to John's shoulder. Much obliged. May God watch your land. Lizzy saw the flicker in John's eyes. He tipped his hat, silent as ever, but the gratitude lingered in the air. Lizzy realized then what she had begun to feel all along. John's silence didn't make him distant. It made his deeds thunder louder than words. By the time Dodge City rose before them, they were weary but resolute. The town was a blur of noise and motion, its streets crowded with saloons, merchants, and drovers flush with trail money. Gunsmoke mingled with whiskey, and the air throbbed with piano music spilling from swinging doors. To Lizzy, who had lived among quiet fields and lonely roads, it was overwhelming. John led her straight to the Dodge House Hotel, the best place to find lawmen of repute. They had hardly tethered the horses when a familiar figure stepped onto the porch, Wyatt Earp. He was taller than Lizzy had expected, lean, his long coat moving with the easy grace of a man accustomed to both law and violence. His mustache bristled as his sharp eyes studied them. John Steedman, Wyatt said, his voice flat but not unfriendly. Heard you quit speaking. Didn't think you'd quit fighting. John touched his hat in greeting. He reached for his slate and wrote, Need your help, fraud, Avery, Margaret Dylan. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Avery's a snake. Dylan's worse. You're right to come. From behind Wyatt, another man appeared, shorter but sharper, his presence quicksilver compared to Wyatt's stone. Doc Holliday, pale and coughing into a handkerchief, leaned on the doorframe with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Steedman, Doc drawled, his voice slick with Georgia honey. Seems you've got yourself a pretty partner and a mess of trouble. Lucky for you, trouble's our business. Lizzy bristled at his tone, but John's hand brushed lightly against her arm, steadying her. Inside the hotel's parlor, over a map spread across a scarred table, Wyatt laid out the law. Avery's papers won't stand if we can prove fraud. But Dylan's Gan copper blood backs him. That means gunfire before ink. You'll need witnesses, records, anything to show Avery's debt is forged. Lizzy leaned forward. Where do we find them? Wyatt tapped the map. Banker in Wichita might have been paid to look the other way. And there's a rancher south of here who swore Avery never owned cattle enough to stake a claim. If we pull those threads, his whole case unravels. Doc smirked. Course, Dylan won't just let you tug on her threads. She's got half a dozen hired guns and a mean streak wide as the Arkansas River. John wrote firmly on the slate, "We stand." Wyatt's eyes held his for a moment, then he nodded. "Then you'd best be ready. Once you tear the mask off Dylan, she won't stop till you're in the ground." Lizzie's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She had lost everything. Once already family, home, safety. This time she would not walk away. That night, as they planned their next move, a rider slipped into town. He wore a red scarf at his throat, and his eyes searched the crowd until they settled on the hotel. Copperblood had followed them to Dodge. The storm Lizzie feared was coming, and Dodge City would be its first lightning strike. The next morning dawned hot and sharp. Dodge City already alive, with boot heels clattering against the boardwalk and the call of barkers outside saloons. Lizzie sat with Wyatt and Doc at the parlor table, the map spread again before them. John leaned against the wall, arms folded, his silence steadying them all. Wyatt tapped the map with one thick finger. "First leads Wichita. Banker there swore a note against your land. Problem is, Avery never had the cattle to back it. If we can find that ledger, prove the ink's fresh instead of aged, it tears." His claim apart, Lizzie frowned. "But Wichita's days away." Doc's grin slanted. "And Dylan's gang is already sniffing in Dodge, which means, darlin', we ain't got days, we got hours." John moved from the wall, slate in hand. He wrote with quick, sure strokes. "What about the rancher south of town?" Wyatt nodded. "Harold Klein. Man swore under oath Avery never drove more than a dozen head, but the record shows 200. If Klein will testify, it's another nail in Avery's coffin." Lizzie leaned closer. "Then we go to Klein first." Wyatt studied her, as if weighing her resolve. Finally, he gave a short nod. "All right. But be ready. Dylan's got eyes in every saloon, every alley." They set out by noon, dust rising behind their horses. John rode point, Lizzie close behind, Wyatt and Doc trailing with eyes sharp on the horizon. Lizzie kept glancing back, expecting to see riders. Red scarves flashing in the sun. She saw nothing, yet unease gnawed at her stomach. The Klein ranch sat low against a rise, its fences sagging, its barn leaning like an old man's back. Harold Klein himself came out to meet them, hat in hand, suspicion sharp in his weathered eyes. "Wyatt Earp," he rasped. "Didn't expect you here." "Need your help," Wyatt said flatly. "It's about Randall Avery." Klein spat in the dirt. "Snake. He's been claiming I vouched for his herd." "I never did." Lizzie stepped forward. "Would you swear to that in Dodge? Put it on record?" The old man's eyes softened on her. "Girl, I've lived through droughts and range wars. Men like Avery thrive on fear. Dylan's worse. She'd burn me out if I opened my mouth." John lifted his slate. He wrote carefully, then held it up. "We protect you." Klein studied him, the scar on his throat, the steadiness in his gaze. Finally, the old rancher nodded once. "If you stand with me, then I'll speak truth. But watch yourselves. Dylan's already sent her dogs sniffing around." As if summoned by his words, gunfire cracked from the ridge. Bullets snapped dust at their feet. Lizzie ducked as John swung her down behind the water trough. Wyatt's Colt was in his hand. In a blink, Doc's Derringer flashing from his vest. 3 riders thundered down the slope, red scarves whipping in the wind. Copperblood. Their pistols barked, Glass shattered, and the air filled with acrid smoke. John moved like a man born for battle. He slid his rifle free and fired clean, one outlaw toppling from the saddle. The others veered wide, circling, shouting. Curses. Lizzy felt the trough shudder as bullets struck wood. She pressed herself low, heart hammering. Wyatt's voice cut sharp through the din. "Hold steady." Another shot cracked, Doc's this time precise and lethal. The second outlaw tumbled into the dust. The last turned tail, spurring his horse hard, retreating into the hills with a wild cry. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the whimper of a wounded horse. Lizzy lifted her head, breath ragged, and saw John lower his rifle. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. Klein staggered forward, staring at the bodies. Margaret Dylan won't forgive this. She'd come herself with more. Wyatt holstered his gun. Let her. But first, we get your testimony on record. Tomorrow you ride with us into Dodge. Klein nodded slowly. So be it. That night, back in town, the saloon buzzed with whispers. News of the skirmish traveled faster than whiskey. Lizzy felt the weight of every glance as she walked beside John. To them, she was the stray he'd taken in, the farmer's daughter turned survivor. But to Dylan's men, she was a weakness to be exploited. Later, in the quiet of their rented room, John sat by the window, slate in hand. He wrote a single word and turned it toward her. Storm. Lizzy met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Then we'll weather it together. Outside, unseen in the shadows of Dodge, Margaret Dylan herself arrived, her eyes sharp, her smile thin as a knife. The Copperblood gang had lost 3 riders, and she intended to balance the scales. Dodge City was a place accustomed to trouble, but when Margaret Dylan rode in, even the gamblers at the Long Branch paused their card games. She was not the kind of outlaw who slouched in shadows. She sat her black horse tall, dressed in a dark riding coat with silver buttons that caught the sun. A wide-brimmed hat shaded sharp eyes, and her red scarf was tied high on her throat like a badge of blood. 6 riders followed her, each wearing the same scarf, each armed to the teeth. The Copperblood gang. Their spurs clinked, their horses foamed, and the street cleared as though a storm had just rolled in. Lizzy watched from the hotel balcony, her heart hammering. She had never seen Margaret before, but she felt the weight of her presence, immediately cold, calculating, merciless. Beside Lizzy, John stood like carved stone, rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. His eyes tracked Dylan with unblinking calm. Margaret dismounted, her boots striking the boardwalk with purpose. She stepped into the Long Branch, the gang fanning out to block the doors. Lizzy and John exchanged a glance, then descended the stairs. Wyatt was already moving, long coat swinging, hand resting easy near his revolver. Doc strolled behind, his grin razor thin, a cough shaking him before he steadied with a swallow from a silver flask. Inside, the saloon fell to a hush. Margaret Dylan claimed a table at the center, her men circling like wolves. She pulled off her gloves with deliberate slowness, tossing them onto the table as though she owned the place. Wyatt stepped forward. Dylan, Earp. Her voice was smooth, measured, carrying just enough steel to cut. Seems you've taken up with a mute rancher and his little stray. Interesting company for a lawman. Lizzy bristled, fists clenched at her sides, but John's hand brushed her arm. anchoring her. His silence was sharper than words. Margaret's gaze flicked to him. "You've caused me inconvenience, Steedman. 3 of my men dead. You'll pay for that." Wyatt's tone was flat. "Your men drew first. Law says that makes their graves their own doing." Margaret's smile curved, cold and mocking. "Law? In Dodge City? Law is what men with guns decide it is. And right now, my papers say Painted Rock is mine." Doc chuckled low. "Funny thing about paper, ma'am. It burns real easy when the ink don't hold." Her eyes snapped to him, dangerous, but she didn't rise. Instead, she leaned back, drumming her fingers on the table. "You think you found friends, Steedman. But no lawman, no dying dentist, no orphan girl can save your land. Give it up now, and I'll let you leave with your lives." John stepped forward, his boots striking the floor with quiet weight. He took the slate from his coat, scrawled with firm strokes, then turned it toward her. "Not yours, never." A ripple moved through the room. Margaret's smile faltered for the briefest instant, then hardened. She stood slowly, her men tensing around her. "Very well," she said, her voice dropping like the click of a hammer. "If you won't surrender, then you'll be buried beneath your own roof. I'll come for Painted Rock, and when I do, I'll salt the earth so nothing grows again." She turned, her coat swirling, and strode from the saloon. Her men followed, boots and spurs echoing like drums of war. Outside, horses stamped and snorted, then carried the gang away into the darkening horizon. For a long moment, no one in the Long Branch spoke. The piano man let his hands fall silent on the keys. The barkeep wiped his glass with trembling fingers. "Wyatt," broke the silence. "She means every word." Lizzy drew a breath. "Then we don't wait for her to come. We make our case now. We show the fraud before she can burn Painted Rock to the ground." John's hand pressed to the slate again, and he wrote, "Home. Defend." Wyatt nodded grimly. "Then it's settled. We gather what proof we can, but be ready. Dylan won't sit idle. She'll bring fire and blood." That night, as Lizzy lay awake, thunder rumbled low on the horizon, though the sky held no storm clouds. It was the sound of hooves, of a gang sharpening its knives, and of a battle drawing near. Painted Rock had become more than land. It was a stand against everything Margaret Dylan represented, and Lizzy knew the final reckoning would not wait long. The road back to Painted Rock felt heavier than when they had left it. Every hoofbeat carried the weight of Margaret Dylan's promise, every mile a drumbeat toward the inevitable. Lizzy rode beside John, her hands tight on the reins, eyes flicking across the ridges as though expecting red-scarfed riders to appear at any moment. Wyatt and Doc flanked them, steady and unhurried, yet every glance between the 2 lawmen told Lizzy they knew what awaited. When the sandstone bluff finally rose on the horizon, the mark of John's land, Lizzy's chest tightened. But relief vanished as they drew closer. Smoke. The barn had been torn open, its doors hanging like broken arms. Fences lay crushed. The cabin windows were shattered, the porch posts hacked to splinters. Margaret Dylan's promise had already touched their home. Lizzy dismounted first, her boots crunching glass beneath the porch. She stepped inside the cabin, quilts torn, the cedar chest overturned, clothes slashed. John's careful order destroyed in a single night. She felt heat rise in her throat, not fear but fury. John followed, silent, shoulders rigid. He moved slowly through the wreckage, his hand brushing the broken chair, the slate lying cracked in 2 pieces on the floor. Lizzy saw him pick it up, thumb brushing the jagged edge. For a moment, she thought he might shatter entirely. Instead, he drew a breath, set the slate down gently, and turned to Wyatt. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "She wanted you to find this. Message is clear, she's coming back to finish it." Doc leaned against the doorframe, pale but steady. "Then best we set the table before our guests arrive," and so they began. For 3 days, they worked to mend what they could and fortify what they could not. Wyatt directed with the calm of a man who had seen sieges before. He placed firing lines, cut slits in the barn walls for rifles, and marked positions behind the stone of painted rock itself. John rebuilt the fences not as barriers for cattle, but as traps for menrails, sharpened into stakes, wire strung to slow advancing riders. He carried timber as though fueled by the storm inside him, each strike of the hammer a vow. Lizzy worked beside him, her hands raw but unflinching. She hauled buckets from the well, stacked ammunition, and cooked what little food they had left to keep their strength. At night, she sat with Doc as he coughed into a cloth spotted red, yet still sharpened his pistols with the devotion of a priest tending relics. When the sky turned the color of tarnished silver on the 3rd evening, Lizzy stood at the edge of the yard, gazing west. "Do you think we can hold?" Wyatt joined her, arms folded. His gaze remained on the horizon. "Depends how bad Dylan wants it. But I'll tell you, this land's just land until folks are willing to bleed for it. Then it becomes something else. Becomes a stand." Lizzy swallowed hard. She looked back at John, who worked by lantern light, his shadow long against the cabin wall. "We'll stand," she whispered. That night a storm gathered. Clouds rolled thick over the prairie, thunder grumbled low, and lightning carved the sky. The wind carried the scent of rain and of horses. Lizzy heard them first, faint like the distant roll of drums. She stepped out onto the porch, heart in her throat. The horizon burned with torchlight. Wyatt came up behind her, his voice grim. "They're here." John stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his eyes fixed on the flickering glow that crept closer with every heartbeat. He touched the brim of his hat once, steady and unafraid, then stepped into the yard. Lizzy followed, her hands trembling but her chin lifted. From the dark, the Copper Blood Gang rode in, dozens of riders, red scarves gleaming wet in the stormlight. At their head, Margaret Dylan herself, black coat snapping in the wind, her smile sharp as the lightning that split the sky. She raised her hand. The riders spread, encircling painted rock like a tightening noose. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, hissing against the torches. Lizzy's breath caught. The siege had begun. The storm broke the moment the Copper Blood Gang tightened their circle. Lightning slashed the sky, thunder cracked, and rain came down in sheets, drenching men, horses, and earth alike. Torches hissed and sputtered, smoke curling across the yard as painted rock became an island of defiance in a sea of fire and steel. Margaret Dylan raised her hand, her voice carrying over the storm. "Steedman, last chance. Step out, hand over your land, and maybe I'll spare the girl." Lizzy stiffened, fury burning hotter than fear. She stood at the cabin door, rifle clutched tight. John's hand brushed her shoulder, steady and sure. telling her without words, "You are not alone." Wyatt Earp strode into the yard, long coat plastered. To him with rain, his revolver gleamed beneath the torchlight. "Margaret, you talk too much." A shot cracked. Doc Holliday, pale as death itself, fired from the porch. The bullet struck sparks from a gang member's rifle, knocking him clean off his horse. Chaos erupted. The siege began. Bullets whined through the rain. Horses screamed. The copper blood surged forward in a wave, red scarves flashing like bloody banners. John dropped to one knee, rifle pressed to his shoulder, and fired. One outlaw spun and fell. Lizzy followed his lead, heart hammering, squeezing the trigger until her shoulder ached. Her first shot missed wide, but the second struck true, dropping a rider who had charged too close. Wyatt moved like stone come alive, revolvers barking in rhythm, each shot deliberate, each strike thinning the tide. Doc, coughing between curses, fought with the wild brilliance of a man who lived every breath as though it were his last. The gang pressed hard, bullets thudding into the barn walls, splintering the cabin logs. But John had laid his traps well. Rails broke beneath charging hooves. Wires snapped riders from saddles. Stakes pierced the mud. The storm itself fought on their side, turning ground to mire and torches to smoke. Lizzy ducked behind the trough as a bullet split the post beside her head. She gasped, rain plastering her hair to her face. John was at her side in an instant, pulling her up, pointing toward the boulder of painted rock. Together they scrambled to its shelter, rifles braced on stone, firing into the storm of men that crashed against their land. Through the chaos, Margaret Dylan rode tall, black coat snapping, her rifle cracking like a whip. She cut down her own men if they faltered, her smile cold as ice. When her eyes met Lizzy's across the storm, Lizzy felt the weight of all Dylan's malice crash upon her. "You'll die in the mud, girl," Dylan shouted, her voice carrying over thunder. "No," Lizzy whispered to herself, teeth clenched. "Not today." She fired again. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The gang surged, broke, surged again. The defenders 4 souls against dozens, held by grit and storm. Every time Lizzy thought they would be overrun, John's rifle spoke, Wyatt's iron barked, or Doc's laugh rang out defiant through the smoke. But the cost grew. Doc stumbled, coughing blood, yet still lifted his gun. Wyatt's arm bled where a bullet had grazed him. John's coat was torn at the shoulder, red seeping through, though he never faltered. At last, lightning struck so close the ground shook. The flash lit everything, riders, smoke, blood, rain, and in that moment John and Margaret locked eyes across the yard. She wheeled her horse forward, breaking from her men, rifle raised straight for him. "Steedman," she roared, "I'll take your land with your life." John dropped his rifle, seized Lizzy's weapon, and rose from behind the boulder. His scarred throat gleamed pale in the stormlight. Margaret fired her bullet, clipped stone near his chest. John's shot answered, clean and true. Margaret Dylan jerked in the saddle, her rifle slipping from her hands. For a heartbeat she stared, eyes wide, disbelief painted on her face. Then she toppled backward into the mud, the storm closing over her like a shroud. A silence fell. The gang wavered, their leader gone. Some cursed, some fled, spurring their horses into the rain-dark horizon. A few dropped their guns outright, surrendering as Wyatt strode forward, his revolver steady. The siege was broken. Lizzy staggered to John's side, her chest heaving, rain mixing with tears on her cheeks. She looked at Margaret's lifeless form in the mud, then back at Painted Rock's battered walls. It still stood. They still stood. But as thunder rolled away into the distance, Lizzy knew the fight wasn't truly over. Avery still lived, and with him, the false claim to their home. Morning rose slow and pale, the storm clouds lifting to reveal a prairie washed clean. Smoke curled from the ruined barn, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the damp air. Dead men lay where they had fallen, torches long extinguished in the mud. Painted Rock Ranch stood battered, scarred, but unbroken. Lizzy walked across the yard, her boots sinking into wet earth. Her muscles ached, her hands blistered from rifle fire, but her heart beat steady. John stood near the boulder, his rifle hanging loose at his side, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked at her, and though no words came, she saw relief in his eyes, relief, and something deeper, quieter, that needed no voice to speak. Wyatt and Doc emerged from the cabin. Wyatt carried himself stiff, arm bound where a bullet had grazed him, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Doc leaned on the doorway, pale, a rag at his lips, but his grin lingered despite the blood on his handkerchief. "Well," Doc rasped, "I'd call that a proper party. Shame about the company." Wyatt ignored the quip, his voice steady. "We'll ride to Dodge. Avery'll be there, hiding behind his papers. Now we've got the proof, and Margaret Dylan's dead. The rest falls to law." And so it did. 2 days later, with Harold Klein riding at their side, they entered Dodge City once more. Avery was found in the Alhambra saloon, glass of whiskey in hand, confidence still painted across his face. But when Wyatt laid the forged papers on the bar, when Klein swore under oath, and when the banker's ledger revealed ink too fresh for its claim, Avery's smirk faltered. "You can't," he began, but Wyatt's iron tapped the table once. Sharp and final. The deputies closed in, irons clamping around Avery's wrists. His protests drowned beneath the clatter of shackles. Lizzy watched him led away, shoulders slumped, and felt no triumph, only relief. The weight lifted. The land was John's again. Painted Rock was safe. By the week's end, the court declared the claim void. The ranch remained Steedman's. Avery was bound for a cell, his allies scattered. The Copper Blood Gang, leaderless, bled away into the frontier, leaving only stories and smoke in their wake. When John and Lizzy returned to Painted Rock, the land greeted them with silence, the kind of silence that promised peace, not threat. Together, they set about the work of rebuilding. Fences were mended, the barn repaired, cattle gathered again to the pastures. Every stroke of the hammer, every lifted rail, carried not just labor but renewal. At dusk, Lizzy often stood by the boulder, the streak of iron red against pale stone, and thought of what it had cost. She thought of her family, of the wandering hunger that had nearly claimed her, of John's scar and his silence. And she thought of the life they had built out of ruin. One evening, as the sun dipped low and Painted Rock glowed gold, John joined her. He carried the slate, now mended, its cracks bound with wire. He wrote carefully, each word deliberate. "Home with you." Lizzy's throat tightened. She took the chalk, her hand trembling, and beneath his words she wrote, "Family." He looked at it for a long moment, then reached out, his rough hand closing over hers. Silence stretched between them, but it was no longer empty. It was full of promise, of love, of a bond forged in storm and fire. Painted Rock Ranch became a sanctuary in the years that followed. Travelers found food there, drifters found work, and the broken found kindness. Folks spoke of it in Dodge and Wichita, a place where two souls scarred by loss had chosen to build, rather than burn. And though John Steedman never spoke another word, his name and Lizzy's became part of the prairie's story, a reminder that even in the harshest frontier, compassion could grow and love could stand unbroken. The prairie wind sighed across the grass, carrying with it the memory of the siege, the echo of gunfire, the laughter of those who endured. And on Painted Rock, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, Lizzy and John stood together, their silence speaking louder than any words. In the unforgiving heart of the frontier, Lizzy and John proved that even silence can speak louder than fear, and that love can grow where loss once reigned. Their stand at Painted Rock was more than a fight for land, it was a fight for hope, family, and the belief that broken souls can build something unshakable. If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment. We treasure your thoughts and read each one. Subscribe for more tales of love, courage, and redemption on the Wild West frontier.